In Monster Hunter Wilds, Eric gives the hypothesis that the Shagama hunt together to acquire prey they couldn't alone, the shaky group being bound by profit. And this feels unlikely. If they're literally killing other higher-ranked monsters, then there's no reason they couldn't just team up and eat Uthduna in the forest, rather than having to walk all the way to try and take down Raidau. In their first cutscene, we see the Alpha Deshagama easily take down a bull Karatanoth, and alone too. All in all, this hypothesis seems unlikely. If they are eating other large monsters, then they don't need to leave the forest. If they're not, there's nothing in the plains that requires a group to take down. Chemitrice is also introduced in the plains, and is canonically a scavenger, cleaning up the dead left by the sand tide or other predators. However, Karatanoth aren't especially fast. Chemitrice at its fastest trot is at least fast enough to require the Sacred to sprint to catch it. And Chemitrice is also undoubtedly large and strong enough to simply kill a Karatanoth itself. With the infrequency and unpredictability of carrion as a resource, and the hyperabundance of Karatanoth combined with their ease of capture, there is essentially no real reason for a large scavenger to evolve in such an environment. In fact, with the slow, weak and abundant Karatanoth, it is literally less profitable to scavenge than it is to hunt for essentially anything in the roster. Both of these problems in the lore stem from the same issue. There simply aren't enough powerful, fast, and/or generally well-defended herbivores, in the context of the series, to justify a lot of the monster's apparently predatory adaptations. Not only this, but so many easily captured herbivores reduce the need for competition that could justify such combative adaptations otherwise. The super competition school of thought, a generous term for something that seems to have been created in the absence of either schooling or thought, doesn't work if there's nothing to compete over, even in a fictional world. If herbivores, and therefore food, are so easy to acquire for carnivores, there's essentially no reason to defend a kill due to how low stakes and low effort a resource is to acquire. It would be like us fighting someone to death over a patch of especially breathable air. Although give it 20 years and that'll probably be a reality. It really is that easy to just go and get another. As said, they're hyper-abundant and take no real effort to take down at press time. Currently, most herbivores in the series take the form of small monsters, and the small monsters aren't necessarily bad. At least in 1st and 3rd gen, Aptonoth are portrayed with both some degree of speed to escape predators, and the adults are generally too large and too well defended for the small pack-hunting bird wyverns, who have to rely on the large dromes and greats if they're going to get an adult, with the males also apparently taking on some minor anti-predator role. Aptonoth are generally smaller than their original chief predators of Rathalos from the air and Plesioth from the water, who generally aren't that common compared to the small bird wyverns. However, some may and do have doubts on the success of Aptonoth seemingly being the main herbivore. But this isn't so unexpected. Herbivore species can often become very successful, with some species becoming super abundant in certain areas, like wildebeest in the East African plains, or just generally having a wide distribution like kudu, warthog or zebra, or having both a wide distribution and achieving spots of local superabundance like impala. Sometimes abundance can passively or actively displace or outcompete other herbivores too, so where one is superabundant it can explain a dearth in the other. The why of such abundance has already been speculated on in the herbivore video, likely to do with reproduction and feeding. But all this to say that a lack of diversity isn't necessarily awful at this level. And Aptonoth aren't the only herbivores either. Apsaros are also there, generally getting less to do in both cutscenes and gameplay, but in 5th gen they do get the nice triangle defense formation, that lore-wise is apparently supposed to save them despite a lack of power, and everything in the wilds bar eating them. Popo have also been a series staple since 2nd gen, chiefly as both beasts of burden or the primary diet of Tigrex. Slagtoth dwell in wetlands, also apparently challenging wyverns. Gargwa in the forests, and Larinoth are also in the series. Updates to 5th gen onwards did see some diversity too, with the small herbivore brutes like Kestodon in World, Gowngoats in Sunbreak, and Karatanoth in Wilds. So from lore points of diversity and gameplay, small herbivores are doing okay. Local superabundance from a successful generalist species is fine, and also what we'd expect to see. And as the series progresses, there's a clear effort to make more diverse and original ecosystems, rather than relying on the old reliable Aptonorth endlessly. Whilst the small monsters of any dietary requirement aren't meant to be especially formidable in any sense, the progression of the series does add some doubt to their credibility. Whilst it's far from unfeasible for them to survive, again, see their video, but you also can't blame people for thinking that at times. Because in the early days, the greater specialization in rosters mitigated that feeling considerably. Originally, Aptonorth was the deer to Rathalos's wolf, and the rest of the second-gen roster didn't really eat adults, other than occasionally Plesioth, as they weren't carnivores or lived in different areas. The same can be said of Popo and Tigrex too. Apsaros only really had to worry about stray Rathian or Cephadrome, or Plesioth when they came to water, much as any herbivore has to worry about crocodiles in tropical and subtropical areas. Now they all live alongside vast rosters of fairly abundant carnivores that can kill them in a blink, and they have literally no defense against. They're too slow to outrun and too weak to outfight. It's not one game that's done it too, but more the Ultimate Editions carelessly spaffing monsters to the wind and putting them in every map possible. Bespoke adaptations be damned. But probably ask the average person on the street, or indeed the average gamer, and their response would be, why should a herbivore be more formidable? Herbivores are there to run away or get eaten. They're prey items and are therefore meat, and a diet of plants means they have no reason to kill. And this isn't strictly true. Probably the best example are of course Cape buffalo, who are often a preferred prey of certain lion prides, but not without cost. Buffalo can put up a real fight both singly and as a herd, and under certain levels of predation will even develop specialized anti-predator behaviors, extending to killing lions before they can do the same. So in this regard, buffalo do suit ideally as a species Eric could have been envisioning for his hypothesis. Tough to take down, dangerous alone and as a group, and not scared of striking first either. Buffalo are best known and most well developed in this sort of behaviour, but it's not unheard of for other herbivores, and especially large ones in general, to attack or generally initiate with predators on seeing them. With their annual hormonal death rages and general belligerence, elephants will often chase and displace predators, and can also elicit fear responses in other herbivores too. So whilst many people can probably look at a reasonably tough animal and assume it and not go down without a struggle, it's perhaps not common knowledge some would actually go out of their way to start things themselves. So an initial cause of any wondering, does Monster Hunter have a herbivore problem, could be that it's just generally not common knowledge as to how dangerous herbivores can be to other animals in an ecosystem, including the fierce, evil, meat-eating predators and not just people. Some may argue this has little relevance, to which I'd respond with the fact the developers themselves have repeatedly stressed the importance of ecology and real-world animals in the creation of Monster Hunter. But on this topic, one thing I do think is really relevant is just how prevalent herbivores are in hunting, which is always good to consider in a series called Monster Hunter. As a brief caveat, it can often seem that the universal desire for more competent herbivores invariably has to become about them being martially competent, overcompetent in any other form of defense, like speed or crypsis. And the fact the game revolves around hunting does somewhat force the hand here. Large monsters have to partake in the core gameplay loop of combat, and thus must be able to fight. Flight is the best method of anti-predator defense, as said in past videos about herbivores, and to be said again here. But flight has a limited role, due to the fact the series is called Monster Hunter and not Monster Chaser, and monster herbivores are awful at that too. Again, to return to buffalo, they're probably the most mythologized animals in terms of big game hunting, for the near supernatural ferocity, cunning and strength displayed when wounded and backed into a corner. Plenty hunters were and are killed by them, and there are dozens of old stories from great white hunters about their dramatic buffalo hunts, including a likely exaggerated one of someone who managed to escape a horning up a tree and was then gnawed to death by a buffalo instead. To broaden things, 3 of the African Big Five, the 5 most dangerous animals to hunt on foot, consisting of lion, leopard, African buffalo, black rhino, and African elephant, are herbivores, and the herbivores are near invariably given higher press than the cats too. Hippos are perhaps the only herbivores that have clawed their way to public recognition of their danger, with the oft-repeated statement of them killing more people in Africa than any other animal. A statement which may hold some water, but also likely stems from the fact they have so many more encounters than other animals, due to communities needing to gather water from hippo-filled sources. More anecdotally, even smaller herbivores are often widely regarded in hunting. Bush buck and bush pig are regarded as such good sports due to the aggressive defense they mount, with both being recorded to kill dogs and charge hunters, and the former especially having several cases of them goring personnel to death as well. In contrast, similar-sized carnivores like painted wolf or cheetah are barely given a footnote in hunting from times or locations when it was allowed, rather being viewed as vermin. Even the powerful and enduring spotted hyena is known, if it is known by hunters, for its cunning rather than its impressive strength and stamina. In short, the more literate one becomes in zoology, ecology, or outdoor pursuits, the more unavoidable the facts are that most of these fields are far more cautious of herbivores than carnivores. Those often arguing against the importance of both real-world animals and ecology also have no real leg to stand on here either. The Ermanthian boar, Cyrenian hind, and Cretian bull were with the Nemean lion in Hercules' 12 Labours. Chinese mythology has its Fengshi, a two-headed boar. The Epic of Gilgamesh featured the Bull of Heaven, just to name a few. As in short, mythology and culture across the globe repeatedly stress the importance and danger of herbivores too. Thinking about it, it really is a very modern and 21st century take that they're all limp-wristed doilies waiting to be eaten. But of course, speaking of modern herbivores, Monster Hunter isn't just small monsters, and its fightable rosters aren't just carnivores either. What are the actual fightable herbivores like? To start with, the big four, or three, depending on if you lump the bloss wyverns, are of course Gammoth, Duramboros, Monobloss and Diablos, the former of those two having taken an indefinite break since 4th gen. Initially it would have been tempting to say they successfully fill the role of tough herbivore, but a hard-eyed look really suggests otherwise. Gammoth is easily the worst offender, being one of the largest monsters in the franchise, but probably pound for pound the weakest. Despite towering over carnivores, being known as a moving mountain, and having the motif that she only falls in death, her knockdown being her taking a knee, she's really nothing special. Her physical equal is Tigrex, a monster a fraction of her mass. Whilst the fandom have pondered how this can be the case, with Tigrex's most powerful weapon doing nothing to Gammoth, and Gammoth's most middling retaliation sending Tigrex flying across the arena, this isn't what the fandom rationalize, but more what Capcom say. I think Gammoth is a really good example of how their refusal to actually just let certain monsters be as strong as they look really hamstrings the themes they try to make for them. As said, Gammoth is known as the moving mountain, and she only falls in death. And this is completely wasted on something in the same power bracket as basic Rathalos. Imagine hearing similar guff before fighting Chatacabra and just obliterating it in one charged slash. You would wonder what all the fuss was about. And that's just it. A lot of fuss and bluster for a monster that canonically right now doesn't warrant it in the slightest. A joke of a fight that's considered equal to an angry little lizard a fraction of her mass. What's all the fuss about indeed? In trying to create something strong, they only succeeded in creating something that proportionally is ridiculously weak. For a time, the bloss wyverns were essentially the ideal notion of this trope. Introduced in the first game, Monobloss was set up as the most powerful wyvern / non-elder monster, with Diablos in second place, both surprisingly being above the lava-swimming Gravios. So in the non-elder offline game, the top dogs were indeed herbivores, essentially invulnerable to predation as healthy adults, and who carried notable symbolic value to hunt. This trend continued for the most part into 2nd gen, with Monobloss and Rathalos being kept essentially as post-game content after Kokoto is unlocked. In 3rd gen, some things did begin to change. Agnacta and Deviljho were introduced, and Diablos now had to put up with being 3rd, and then Brachydios was ostensibly placed above Agnactor. so now carnivores were pretty strongly on top among the wyverns. But Diablos was still a high apex, which does seem to be a genuine if not diegetically mentioned rank in game, so still a reasonably big deal. Whilst this rank did persist into 4th and 5th gen, Diablos itself didn't stay in it, and come base world, he's now slap bang average next to Rathalos. While still being the best rendition of Diablos to date as king, or perhaps rather queen, of the Wildspire, this nerfing comes into full force with Deviljho. Past and present high apex Uragan is spared a one-sided beatdown, unlike other apexes, enjoy it while it lasts buddy, as is Lavasioth, despite both being tempting targets as warring apexes of the recess. But Diablos, now booted down a level in power, gets easily overcome. A herbivore who would have once likely been invulnerable has now been downgraded so it can show off a carnivore. Whilst I've said plenty about this before, that doesn't need repeating, and to look at Joe's video's view count you've already seen it, this is a turf war many question. On a similar note as well, the huge size and strength of Diablos, despite a lack of elemental attacks, was both quite a statement and the reason they were higher ranked than the more typical dragons. Their downgrade to basic apex both makes for a more reductive world, and, like Gammoth, puts Diablos on equal footing with monsters it feels impossible to believe are its peers. There is some mitigation. Black Diablos avoids it, and is canonically strong enough to repel Deviljho too. But we get no reverse turf war, and come Iceborne she gets the same fate against Savage. Although as an Iceborne sloppy and paced, I guess you can argue against its relevancy. It does vary in-game though, as Ichinose does love Diablos. In 2nd gen he's a G-rank Elder equal alongside Rajang and Tigrex, and he's permanently high apex in his games. And Ichinose also loves the idea of superpowered Diablos too, starting the trope in Freedom Unite with the one-horned Demon King, and then progressing this to its explosive conclusion in Generations Ultimate's Bloodbath, the strongest and presumably Elder tier Deviant. Though with general weaker implementation and ambience, and a greater focus on the individual over the species, portable additions never feel like they help the cause that much. As lumbering dimly along at the end as it always does, is Duramboros. Duramboros is almost a prototype Gammoth for Ichinose, specified to be stronger than Zinogre, but then given nothing in-game to really suggest this, and a ridiculously abusable fight that makes it a complete joke, and significantly easier than several preceding monsters, spending the vast majority of the fight knocked over, because it either knocked itself over with its signature move, or because you knocked it over from the damage it accumulated whilst it was trying to get up, from knocking itself over with said move. In theory, its possible mainline could remedy this, a statement that now has considerably less weight behind it after Wilds, but at the same time I think part of these issues stem from the fact Portable don't really do big and /or strong and /or slow monsters, as well as mainline. They did have some success with Yukanlos, but he was also made 17 years ago. Since then, the increase in speed and power of the Hunter, in Portable especially, really shows that without an overhaul, there's just not much room for such monsters in those games. But the big 3/4 aren't the only herbivores. There are a handful of others too. Bulldrome, Lagombi and Bambaro, to name some. And it really is worth noting not every herbivore needs to be a powerhouse. I'm generally pretty happy with the idea of Bulldrome and Lagombi getting eaten regularly. And for ecological reasons too. Similarly, Puki's character is informed by it not being that powerful, and it's much more interesting as the rank that it is. I think overall, from the fact they have made herbivores that are decent as herbivores, that they more struggle nowadays with making, or perhaps rather implementing, powerhouse herbivores and more interesting small monsters than herbivores as a whole. As not every herbivore is an elephant or buffalo, or even a bush bug. There are plenty deer and impala. But then you can argue that deer and impala are already represented by small monsters, and the walking stake need not be represented further in the fightable ones. Similarly, running away is already represented to a degree, and is far better known as an escape tactic of herbivores. It is still the best one in fact, but fighting herbivores can seemingly still be considered somewhat subversive in fiction. And there are varying levels of power too, and having both is often good. The bushbuck is an example again. Whilst it can fight fiercely against dogs and people, Against a lion, its number is up, and running is the better option. And it's regularly eaten by painted wolves and leopard especially, even if it can put up a solid resistance before going down. I think Bambaro is an okay example here, or maybe it would be if not for the Beatodus copy and paste. Too much for, say, Viper Tobikadachi, but still susceptible to Tigrex or Barioth predation. I don't actually want to see Bambaro made stronger. I like it where it is, but would rather like to see him be shrank so he's less ridiculously big for what he is. But what about diversity and numbers? As I did say, there's a handful. How well represented are herbivorous monsters in the scope of the series? And to actually tally it up, not especially well. You can argue herbivores are the second most common grouping outside of other, which is for those not common enough to have their own category, like Carapaco's Piscivore or Valhazak's miasma absorption. But this is a pretty anemic victory just to look at the scale of carnivore dominance, which genuinely is pretty surprising, with carnivores being over 6 times as numerous as other large monsters. You could fill an entire roster with nothing but new herbivores, and you still wouldn't close the gap. There are some other interesting notes. Insectivores are doing pretty well for themselves, it has to be said. And it really surprised me how low geophages scored, perhaps due to the few present being such iconic and prevalent monsters. It feels like they just carry more weight. Overall, in terms of a numerical bias, then yes, Monster Hunter does indeed have a very heavy carnivore slant. You can try to argue this is due to the fact meat-eaters would obviously be desperate to try man-flesh, and so make more common antagonists, but this is literally wrong. Look at human-wildlife conflict, and herbivorous animals will kill people, scare people, eat crops, and generally cause damage. Sometimes even more so than carnivores will. Real herbivores give people plenty reason to engage in human-wildlife conflict. Fictitious ones can do all that and more. Again, the whole fictional world, though, argument doesn't save you here. In fact, you can literally reverse that argument, if fiction is an exaggeration of the real world. In-game, existing quests for all dietary classes are often born of fear or minor human-wildlife conflict, and actual mortalities are rare. A lot of reasons for hunting carnivorous monsters have little to do with them actually eating people. There's no real reason a Monster Hunter carnivore should be so much more destructive than a Monster Hunter herbivore. In fact, you can argue many Monster Hunter villages are made of things some herbivores may want to eat, like the wood-eating Duramboros. And they have crop-growing farms too. There really is plenty reason to hunt them. It's actually far less likely the giant carnivores are going to want to bother with eating people in comparison due to their huge size. But with all that said, how relevant is it really to the series? Does Monster Hunter actually need more competent herbivores? And if so, why? I think there's a lot of things you can argue the series doesn't need per se, but would be considerably worse off without. And with herbivores, much of it comes down to references drawn really. Monster Hunter takes a lot from the natural world, but plenty other sources too. Much of mythology and fantasy in general doesn't really have functioning ecosystems in the way the series does, and a lot of other monster media like kaiju films often don't have herbivore-inspired monsters. Look at most of the Toho lineup, and even if the current canon seems to be they absorb energy and such, most of them are clearly designed with some idea or inspiration of carnivore in mind. Not you though, Mothra. The very base and core concept of a dragon is often designed to be interpreted as carnivorous too. So much of it comes down to what the greater inspiration or pastiche is. Dinosaurs are a major inspiration too, and whilst the team readily depict carnivorous ones, herbivorous dinosaurs are commonly neglected, with their 2 most prevalent roles being just as food sources, when in actuality the animals they're based on would be nigh untouchable as adults. Same with elephants. But then, as a pro and con, creators don't necessarily owe a debt of accuracy to their inspirations. Untouchable herbivores can be made as weak as wished, and traditionally carnivorous dragons can be remade as herbivores. But for the sake of lore, you can argue Monster Hunter needs a few more herbivores across the games and levels in general. Monster Hunter doesn't replicate the natural world one-to-one, but at the same time, diversity and differences are just nice things to have, that lead to a world that feels better constructed. As said, right now the series isn't looking very diverse at all. As said in the opening, from a lore point of view, the series does feel like it's starting to rub up against the fact that herbivores aren't enough to justify a lot of the behaviour seen in carnivores, but also a lot of their own as well. Why do Apsaros try and defend themselves when it's abundantly clear they can't even handle something like Rathian or Duratodus? Really, why does any anti-predator behaviour in Monster Hunter arise other than flight, when herbivores are so incapable of fighting when they try it, and most are too big to hide? And why is flight, seemingly the most viable strategy in Monster Hunter, so underutilized and ineffective? Even fleeing herbivores are pretty slow. Similarly, when you keep making big, slow, yet defenseless herbivores as just fodder for big carnivores, your world really starts to fall apart. It becomes essentially inconceivable that they can make it to adulthood, and then have sufficiently high adult survival to reproduce enough to keep a sustaining population, with such high populations of such lethal predators. And despite the natural rebuttal of fictional world and all that, we can just wrap that up as people defending slop, as there's never any real deeper look or actual defense there. There's that saying in money, look after the pennies and the pounds look after themselves, and I think this applies to fictional universes too. Look after the herbivores and everything else will look after itself as well. Well, actually look after the plants and soil, but still. Monster Hunter right now isn't doing that, and as a result it's weakening the lore of the carnivores as much as the herbivores. But it's also worth noting that you can argue the core gameplay loop encourages neglect of herbivores. If they don't directly serve combat, then they can indeed be viewed as superfluous to resources. So then it brings up a big issue with having more or more formidable herbivores, actually putting them in gameplay. Having a really cool tough herbivore that's just a small monster will inevitably lead players asking, that looks cool, why can't I fight that too? There is definitely a hard cap to the amount of things you can add to a small monster before there definitely becomes surplus to requirements on anyone's budget, regardless of love or lore. But for small monsters, how complex can hunting animations get exactly? Hell if I know. But greater complexity or other factors could be a way to mitigate things. Many herbivores can't really fight, but arguably their bigger lore problem comes from the fact that with this, they can barely also run as well. Not being able to fight is fine if you can run, but that's just not happening. Making faster, warier, or more agile herbivores that can have animations with the possibility of a predator monster failing, or even older-fashioned canned animations that still require pack-hunting monsters to position themselves properly in a stalk and flush, would do a good job selling the idea that not all herbivores are easy, and that some monsters benefit from hunting in packs. After all, the point isn't to make a herbivore that can beat Goku, but any of the following combinations of herbivores that don't need a YouTube explanation to the fanbase to reassure them they won't fall extinct, herbivores with some level of strength, or herbivores that just provide enough pushback in any form to carnivores to justify their behavioural and morphological adaptations. Indeed, in some social predators, the classic behaviours of stalking, flanking and driving can often be necessitated by wary and fleet-footed prey, rather than large and dangerous prey, where strength and /or numbers are more important. Because as said with existing herbivores, not everyone needs to be a tank, and fighting isn't the only way to escape predation. It's always worth remembering flight is actually the best method, or safest, and this would almost certainly apply in Monster Hunter 2. Lagombi exists as a monster that canonically uses flight to escape predators, and it doesn't need and won't benefit from being a powerhouse instead. So Capcom can make these, it's just there's perhaps not enough of them, and not enough of them where it matters in justifying the behaviour of their predators as well. Such animations may seem like a lot of effort, and they likely would be to implement. How far it would go until it becomes unfeasible for time and budget is unknown. On top of this, it also has something of a hard cap of usability, in that if adapted to a fightable monster, one revolving around running away likely wouldn't be especially fun. But overall, it is still a possible solution, and a shift from the current trope. It's also still probably easier than making whole new large/fightable monsters, as on the other hand, having them that are fightable large monsters isn't exactly a picnic either. It's definitely wrong to say the rigs current large herbivores are on are exhausted. It's tempting to say between Pukey and the bloss wyverns it's hard to fit an extra one on the flying wyvern skeleton, but to look at the current diversity and use with no drop in quality, this likely wouldn't be the case. Similarly, we only have one bear herbivore in Lagombi, and whilst Duramboros and Bambaro are somewhat similar, it definitely feels like more brutes can be wrung forth, and bugs in general are still an untapped resource. But for creating new ones, a challenge comes in the fact herbivore is a dietary description, and not a physical skeleton. Unlike the successful introduction of the challenging cephalopod skeleton, there isn't one group you can reliably use to batch create them. A giraffe, parrot, porcupine, stegosaurus, gorilla and moose are all herbivores that lend themselves well to monsterification, with fairly obvious traits or abilities to lean into. But most would have different skeletons, so as well as reusing current skeletons, you may also have to make multiple new ones, which would be very time consuming. On top of this, the majority of the current and best known group of real-life herbivores, ungulates, don't lend themselves especially well to engaging fights. We have 2 ungulate form monsters in the series so far, in Buldrome and Kirin, and both are about as fun and enjoyable as a rabies diagnosis. With unusable tails, relatively stiff bodies and limbs, and limited ability to use the latter, all these traits make ungulates a tough nut to crack for a fun fight that so far remains uncracked indeed. Could Capcom do it? I have faith, but it hasn't been done yet. It's not a surprise a lot of ungulate traits often get put on other monsters instead. It is a surprise some skeletons remain so unused though. With Gammoth seemingly being on the Popo rig and not a modified Celtus Queen one, as I'd believed, the Herbivore/Aptonoth skeleton has only one use for a large monster in the series, despite being introduced in the first game. On that note, I think a real missed trick is not having Aptonoth or other herbivores do more in certain titles. It is a shame 4U was limited to the DS, and Gore has somewhat dragged its feet since, as looking at the massive herds of Keratinoth wilds can now handle, I did often wonder what an experience it could be if an entire herd became frenzied and baying for the hunter's blood. There would be a fine line, with the resultant stat buffing being complete BS to deal with, and too easy to mow them down for an impact, but if done right it could really be a visceral and alarming display of the devastation frenzy can wreak. Some may accuse me of trying to rip off Plague of Madness, but I say if you're going to rip off anything, make it Season 1 of Primal. It's something I generally say is 10 out of 10 entertainment. And besides, if you believe the whole there's only 5 stories we keep repeating, Plague of Madness is just Cujo again. The corruption of something peaceful and /or friendly into something horrifying and bloodthirsty. In this regard, it is worth noting Aptonoth haven't spent their entire time in the franchise skipping out, and Black Veil Valhazak does corrupt them around him to attack the hunter. Their small numbers, weakness, and hesitancy in doing so does hamstring the experience somewhat, but it's still a nice touch that can be built up in future titles. Despite the last 7 pages of script, I do think at least some herbivore discussion is essentially topical runoff from a larger but perhaps less interesting one, which is should monsters be allowed to kill each other and to what extent. After all, this video was peaked more from carnivores and their interactions, or lack of, with hypothetical herbivores over any one herbivore or itself. I only realised the dietary bias when writing this video too. But then this spirals into a purely practical gameplay discussion over a lore one. Despite the memery of Savage Deviljho often being called the 15th weapon type in Iceborne, for how much damage it could deal, we're really at a point where I don't think the series can take any more drops in difficulty. Savage was funny the first time, and then started making hunts borderline redundant, and a mechanic of monsters killing each other would literally gut the core gameplay loop as well, and this falls apart the higher it gets too. If Arkveld could kill the monsters Inc. and other apexes, then Wilds literally wouldn't have an endgame whenever it shows up on the map. But it does feel like a logical continuation and combination of both stamina mechanics and turf wars, and now maps can support tons of monsters at once. It feels more doable than ever. For my own suggestions, I think like turf wars that you only get past a certain hunter rank, or indeed the old ecology videos you got after slaying the monster, you should only get to see such an interaction when you've essentially proven you don't need anything from the victim monster. slaying X amount of them, forging armor from them, being X progression past them, so on. And not everyone should kill and eat everyone else. As said, there needs to be a certain degree of power between them, or you'd be slicing away too much later gameplay. Perhaps only Anjanath tiers and under should be subject to this fate. Generally, such things should only occur when thematically or ecologically appropriate to the monsters, their roles, and their histories, and ideally when separated by a reasonable degree of power too. But when has a fanbase ever agreed on that? Thanks for watching, and thanks as ever to my patrons. Bonecrusher Hyena, Toxic Wolf, The Super Astupa, DJ, My Best Friend Loba, Samburgo, K. Sendem, Octavia of the Fifth Fleet, Nickname 3110, Kieran McCarthy, Flyguns Archives, Hui, Jabin, The Belted Horned Warbler, Big Man Blastoise, Nathan Cross, Johnny, Oni, Tim Kojira, Teddy KGB, Waffles, Slashmaster 101, Dapper Raptor, Aristocrat Mojo, Godzilla Prime 2, Original Username, Small Squid, Littengamer 111, Evilly, Howleth, Archsaw Queen, Tommy Choi, Jacob Wilcox, Seth Fake Last Name, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakumatsu, who keep the channel going with their generosity. And indeed, welcome back to the latest annual round of broader topics in Monster Hunter. Wilds has given me a lot to ponder over, and this topic just happened to be the first one picked in the lineup by my patrons. In fact, most of next year's will likely still be about Wilds to some degree as well. Funnily enough, I never actually thought the general state of herbivores was that bad until I really looked into it. On making the graph, it really was quite a stark contrast. And the biggest prompt for me to make this an option on the poll wasn't any one herbivore, but much more Deshagama's lore and how hard to believe I found it. Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Keen for more herbivores, or nonplussed either way? And be sure to keep an eye out for future broader topics too, which hopefully I'll see you there for.